All right, hello. Today we are going to talk about our next unit, the respiratory system. So if you are using some guided notes, you should be writing down the essential question. And as always with our essential question, we're talking about parts of the respiratory system. How do they contribute to how our human body uses oxygen, discards carbon dioxide, and also maintains homeostasis? So, bottom line, how is that balance maintained? How do we stay healthy and happy? As we go through this, we're going to do a little bit of an overview, talk about the parts of the respiratory system. We're going to touch on diffusion and how that works when we breathe. We'll talk about breathing in and breathing out, or inspiration and expiration. And finally, we'll touch on volume and capacity. All right, let's get into it. First up, we've got functions of the respiratory system. The main ones are to inhale O2, exhale CO2. And if you are somebody who is thinking back to your days in chemistry, hopefully you remember that O2 is a nice little nickname for oxygen. And that CO2 is a nice little nickname for carbon dioxide. Um, and those two gases are really important in keeping our body balanced. One of them, if you're thinking about carbon dioxide, not a great gas for the planet. And if you've taken AP Environmental Science, you might remember that carbon dioxide causes our oceans to get a little more acidic. It can do the same thing to our blood. So when we used to talk about regulating blood pH, those gases, if they're at a balanced level in our body, is keeping our blood at a healthy pH level. The respiratory system also helps with our sense of smell, which leads into how we taste things too. It produces sounds, that's why we can sing and talk to each other. It also filters, warms, and moistens air. Our lungs are very fragile, right? So, these things right here are really fragile. If the air has harmful things in it, that would damage our lungs, so we filter those out. If the air is too cold, we warm it up as we breathe so it doesn't damage those cells in our lungs. And finally, if it would be too dry, it could also damage the delicate cells in our lungs. So those three things need to happen before we get air all the way into our lungs. While we breathe, we are also ridding the body of a little bit of water and heat. So it keeps us at those nice levels for heating and cooling. When we talk about the parts of the respiratory system, we'll kind of divide them in half, the upper half and the lower half. The structures that are in the upper respiratory system include the nose, our nasal cavity, so any space that's open and hollow in our head, which we can kind of see a little bit on that diagram. Off to the right here, so these spaces here, right, help us project sound. We've also got the paranasal sinuses, which are hollow points in our body as well. The pharynx, which is commonly known as the throat, the larynx, which is commonly known as the voice box, which contain our vocal cords, the epiglottis, and cartilage that surrounds it to keep it nice and protected. We'll take a little closer look at the larynx as well in a second here. Parts of the lower respiratory system are really anything from the neck down. So we're talking about the trachea, which is past the throat but still into the lungs, still getting into the lungs. So you can see it right here. The trachea. The bronchial tree is when the trachea branches off to go into the lungs. Right, so the bronchial tree is going to have the bronchi, which are those two that just branched here. As well as the bronchioles. And those bronchioles are those smaller branches that we see getting further and deeper into the lungs. The lungs are also included in the lower half of the respiratory system, and at the very base of the lungs, like as deep as we can possibly go with these structures. You can see these little things that I think they look like raspberries, or they're described as like a cluster of grapes, or I think they look like a nerd's cluster. Those are the alveoli. So those structures are really important. We're going to look at them in depth in a little bit, but they are like the very end of the path for air in terms of its journey in our respiratory system. All right, taking another look at the larynx, otherwise known as the voice box. This is the structure that contains our vocal cords, which are muscle fibers and like elastic tissues. And this is what like actually makes our voice possible. Those things right there. The larynx is composed of muscle and cartilage, so that cartilage is there as protection. Um, and the thyroid also surrounds this. If we think back to what the thyroid was, we've got a little connection to another unit that we covered. Right? We talked about this when we were studying the endocrine system. So if you're trying to connect this to some other units, that was our hormone unit. The thyroid is surrounding the larynx. And if you feel your own like throat when you swallow, you can feel like there's a bump that should be larger. That's your Adam's apple. What you're feeling is just the thyroid cartilage that's there to protect the thyroid and the voice box. But what actually makes our voice possible is we are forcing air through the glottis to make the vocal cords vibrate. So I like to think about this as if you've ever played an instrument, a clarinet, like the reed vibrates to make music. If you've played a brass instrument, your lips like vibrate on the mouthpiece. So if you've played the trumpet, right, a mouthpiece is going to help vibrate. If you play a guitar, those strings vibrate. And that's what makes that music. Those vocal cords vibrating, it's the same concept. So when they vibrate, we get things like talking, singing, or all sounds that you can make with your voice. There's a documentary about some veterinary students who have dissected some larger animals. And if you're interested in hearing maybe the vocal cords of a lion during a dissection, you can check out that video here. But I'm not going to play it because the quality will decrease. But you can see they'll force air through the larynx of the lion that is deceased, that they're doing an autopsy on, to see how air changes the sound of the larynx. All right, now on your guided notes, you have a little table that includes all the parts of the respiratory system that we're going to look at. Some of these you probably do not need to write the description. You probably already know what the nose is. But I know for myself, when I first started learning this, I hadn't really heard about the paranasal sinuses before, right? So that might be something that you need to write a little description and talk about the function of that. If you know all of these already without writing that table in, don't fill it out. You're good to go. But if you would like this to reference as we go through this unit, I think it would be helpful. All right, the next thing we are going to be touching on is diffusion in the respiratory system and seeing what that is and how it serves us. So we're kind of going to use 3 different types of respiration when we talk about diffusion the rest of this unit. We are going to talk about external respiration, which is just breathing, right? We're exchanging gases between the capillaries in our lungs, and we're exchanging those with the air. So when I say capillaries, we're talking about getting those gases into our blood from the air. We're also going to talk about internal respiration. So we are taking the gas in the blood and we're transporting it, right? So it's on its journey. We're going to drop it off at all of our cells so we can use that oxygen in all the cells of our body. And finally, on the deepest level, we're going to talk about how these gases are used in cellular respiration, which is how we get energy. So we're going to use the oxygen that we're breathing in to produce energy in each cell of our body. It might have been a while since you've seen this chemical formula that we have on the bottom here. But we've got 4 different molecules, right? We've got this big one, C6H12O6 here, plus O2, which hopefully we remember is oxygen. And that's going to give us, I'm going to use a different color, that's going to give us carbon dioxide, or CO2. And finally H2O, which is water. And if it's been a while since we've seen that C6H12O6, maybe think to yourself, okay, oxygen, and what other thing do I need to make energy? That other thing should be glucose. Or a sugar, right? So we're getting that from our food. Now, when we're looking at this equation, think to yourself, what are the 2 things that I'm talking about in terms of diffusion in respiration, or diffusion for breathing? You should be thinking about what gases are here, or what are the things that I inhale and exhale. If you are saying that the 2 gases we are looking at are oxygen and carbon dioxide, you are right. Those are the gases that are diffusing in and out of our airways. We're not going to be, and a little bit of water, but these are the 2 we're going to look at in terms of how we diffuse gases through our airways and into our bloodstream. So we're going to travel back to thinking about those alveoli. So those like nerd cluster looking things, or a raspberry or a bunch of grapes. Those are alveoli. One of them would be an alveolus. And if we look at just one of them, we see that it's lying in a capillary network. So basically just like a net of blood is surrounding it. And why is that important? Because we want a lot of access to the bloodstream. So more oxygen equals more energy for us. So if we have a lot of access to the bloodstream here, we get a lot more oxygen going into the blood, ready to get transported to other places. And if we look even deeper at these alveoli now, we can see that the space in between each alveoli and the blood, that's what we're seeing at the bottom in this picture here, is really, really small. And what we are going to see is that we've got gases diffusing from each side. So gas molecules can dissolve in a liquid, and that's what they're doing here as well. Gases dissolve in liquids all the time. That's how your carbonated bubbler that you open each morning to get your daily fix of caffeine, that's why it's bubbly, right? We have carbon dioxide dissolved in that liquid. If you've ever had like a nitro cold brew, that coffee has nitrogen dissolved into it. That's what kind of changes the texture. Oxygen is no different. Oxygen is going to diffuse from our alveoli. So we can see some oxygen right here. It's going to diffuse from the air that we are breathing in. It's going to pass over this membrane, and it's going to diffuse into the blood, right? The opposite is going to happen if we're in like a healthy space with carbon dioxide. So we're going to see parts of carbon dioxide here leaving the bloodstream, passing over that respiratory membrane out into the lungs, and so that's what we can exhale. Right? We want to get rid of that carbon dioxide. We don't need it. Which brings us to our last, or our second to last piece here, inspiration and expiration, which are some words that we don't often use to describe breathing in and breathing out. So when we say inspiration, that means we are breathing in that oxygen. We are inhaling it. This is possible because of some physics going on. If you think about particles in the lungs, here's a X-ray of a lung. There's a low pressure on the lungs. So there's some particles in the lungs of gas, but there's not a lot. There's way more outside. So the pressure in the lungs is some, but it's way less than the pressure that the outside atmosphere is putting on our lungs. When that happens and we open our mouth, air will flood into the lungs, right? Those gas molecules are trying to reach equilibrium, so they will go into the lungs that has us inhaling. We can change the pressure on our lungs due to muscles surrounding the lungs. One of those muscles is the diaphragm. The other group of muscles that play a large role in this is the intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm sits under the lungs, and the intercostal muscles are like around and in our rib cage. And just like how our gases were diffusing from a high concentration to low concentration in the bloodstream, they're going to do the same thing from the outside air to the air inside the lungs. So, like, just how we thought about this before, it's lunchtime. Just how we thought about this before, gases will do that in the atmosphere as well. That's what causes wind. So, it's just wind that is going from the outside air into your lungs. And if you do not remember where the diaphragm is located or the intercostal muscles, here's like a nice image to see that. The diaphragm is this muscle, sits right under the lungs here. When it contracts, it pulls stuff down, which is what's going to pull air into the lungs. When it relaxes, our organs push up on it here, and we'll see what's going on for our next thing for exhaling. And we can see that the intercostal muscles are around our ribs and kind of in our ribs as well. And we can see them right between each rib cage here and a little bit on the side as well. All right, so when we exhale, when we expire, when we breathe out, the pressure in our lungs has now increased. So the particles in our lungs are gas and they're putting more pressure on our lungs. And that's mostly because of our muscles. So when the diaphragm is relaxing, right, those organs are going to push up against the lungs if the diaphragm is relaxed. So that pushes the diaphragm upwards. It makes the space in our lungs smaller and forces that air out of us. If you're trying to exhale more than normal, the muscles that are around and in our rib cage are also going to contract, and we can contract our abs as well to really keep forcing that air out. So our muscles play a huge role in changing like the pressure on our lungs. And so the big idea for breathing in and breathing out, it's all about pressure. So if you're trying to think of the big idea, hey, this is all about changing the pressure. All right, last thing we're going to talk about here, and we'll do a lab also to kind of demonstrate this, and where you get to measure your own lung capacity. We're going to talk about volume and capacity that can be in our lungs. So, to measure this, there's a test called a spirometry test. If you are someone who has asthma, you've probably done this at your doctor. But this is just a procedure that measures air volume. And it's not just any air volume, it's all like how much air can be in your lungs? How much can you hold? And we're going to measure, when we do this lab, we're going to measure 3 different ways of that. We're going to measure the tidal volume. So basically the amount of air that's moving in and out of your lungs when you're just chilling. You are just like hanging out, breathing normally. So I like to think of this as like just normal breathing. We're also going to measure the inspiratory reserve volume, and that's like you forcing the biggest breath of your life, right? It's you maxing out as much as you can. Huge breath, breathing to the max. And then we're also going to look at our expiratory reserve volume, and that's the air you're trying to get rid of. So, like the maximum exhale. So you're trying to like see how much air you can force out of your lungs. There will always be a little bit of air left. That's called the residual volume. We don't have the tools to measure that in class, but that's just the amount of air that's remaining in your lungs after you've forced out the biggest exhale of your life. So there's always still going to be a little bit of gas there. When we do this lab in class next week, we will get to graph your specific details of this to see how many milliliters or like what volume can your own lungs hold. So if we look at this, this is just showing us how much volume can our lungs have total, and we're going to get to measure your own. There are also other ways that air can move in our body. These are non-respiratory movements, so they are things that happen but not to get us oxygen into our body. It's usually from reflexes, so we've got like a little like nervous system connection here and muscular system, so like nerves and muscles. But those can be things like coughing, sneezing, laughing, crying, hiccuping, or yawning. And my own personal cure for hiccups is if I have hiccups and I eat a pickle, I'm pretty sure the electrolytes in those pickles immediately cure my hiccups. So you should try it, see if it works for you too. But if it doesn't, then that's still data. All right, you all are done with the notes on the respiratory system. Make sure you're filling out that summary, trying to answer that essential question, and I will see you real soon.